Educated actually in West Waterloo High School. Later on, after service time, I did education with the city of Waterloo in their engineering department. Actually took international correspondence work. I had 3 older brothers, so I was nearing 17. The next oldest brother was 20 plus. All 3 of those brothers worked at John Deere. He was a tool and die maker. The next one, Willis or Bill Greene, was a pattern maker. And my older brother, Al, or Albert, but called him Al all the time, was actually working somewhere doing bookkeeping type work for John Deere. The 2 older brothers immediately went into the service. They probably left Waterloo in very early January. And the other brother, Homer, was, because he was a tool and die person and the Deere's was going to get into the building stuff for the war and stuff like that, he was deferred. He was actually the only brother that was married. I stayed in high school, and actually in my senior year at high school, which was coming up because I was going to graduate in January. We had midterm classes at that time. So I graduated in January of '43. So the war at that time was only just, 13 months old. I was not going to be 18 for 2 more months. I had no real ambition to jump into the service any sooner than the 18. 2 brothers already in the service, another one that could leave at any time when the deferment was up. So when I was 18, of course, I, like everyone, got a cute little card from the president saying, "Welcome, we would like to plan a vacation for you somewhere in the world, and would you join us?" And so in the meantime, I was working at a Cutler hardware company. So I got a job down there making 35 cents an hour, and did that until I was called into the service I signed up in April. I think I left Waterloo in May. When we went down to Des Moines, there was a bus load that went down from Waterloo, and they lined you up, and we had a choice, actually. They said, what branch would you like to go in? Well, I had a brother in the Marine Corps and a brother in the Navy. So I said, well, I don't want to go in the Army. How about the Coast Guard? And they said, no, we don't have any openings in the Coast Guard. Well, I'll go in the Marine Corps then. They decided that the class wasn't opening up then. It was going to be another month or so. So why don't you do mess duty? Now, mess duty in the Marine Corps means you get $5 more pay per month. Mess duty is not like you see in the cartoons where a guy's done something wrong, so he has to peel potatoes. But you do get paid extra. So I did mess duty for a month, and then at the end of that time, for whatever reason, they said, well, we're not going to send you to Chicago after all. We're going to send you to radio school. And part of that probably was that in the early part of the war, they were losing so many radio men because, somebody carrying something on their back with a long antenna sticking up, that's one of the first targets that the Japs are going to shoot at. So they needed more radio men. So, and the radios in those days, you had a lot of tuning to do. It wasn't like push button yet. So yeah, there was quite a bit that you had to learn in order to run that thing, let alone learn the code and learn all the things about what you do as a radio man. We were salty Marines. We had been in the Marine Corps for, my gosh, all of 7 months. All the rest of the guys coming in there, except for the officers, who were just fresh out of boot camp. But you learned how to drive the tanks. We drove 3 different styles of tanks. We fired 20 millimeter, 37s, 75s, 50 caliber machine guns, 30 calibers, and learned how to tear all that stuff apart and put it back together. And we drove the tanks. Everybody had to learn everyone else's job. We taught guys how to fiddle with the radio, stuff like that. Because if anybody got hurt inside there, somebody had to take over. So it was a very interesting time. After 3 months of that, all of a sudden one day, they come out with a new radio, push button. And they decide that we're going to help install those radios, and then we don't need you anymore. We're going to just teach guys how to push button that thing. and we're going to ship you guys off to the infantry. Well, that didn't sound like too good a thing right off the bat, but once we got to the infantry, they were just then forming up the 5th Marine Division. And alphabetically, they divided us up into the various parts of the division. And everybody up through, we had a guy by the name of Davis. My name was Greene. And the other one that came was DePascal. By the time we got past the G's, Hanson went to the 28th Marines. And so, I mean, we were on temporary duty for the rest of the war. You went through live ammunition training all the time. You crawled with machine gun firing above you, and I mean inches above. They actually had an area where there was a little bit of screening to remind you as you raised your butt up that you were bumping into something, and if you pushed a little bit further, you were going to be taking a bullet. But we had live, you got so used to the noise, my ears still ring. But that we were probably, I mean, I don't think, without a question, the 5th Marine Division was the most highly trained division. That they had plenty of time to train us. 20% of the division was made up of paratroopers and rangers, people like that, who in the early part of the war had a job to do, but now they decided paratrooping was not the thing to do. And having these groups to try to hit these small islands like the raiders would do was not the thing to do anymore. So we absorbed those people, and they were fantastic. Some of the best friends I got were people that came from those organizations, and they helped train us. We had a lot of officers that had started out as PFCs, sergeants, whatever, that earned their bars as they were in the service, so they were extremely intelligent about what we were going to get into. We still, of course, had no idea where we were going. But on July the 22nd of 1944, we started loading ship to depart. And the thing here was that they were going to take the 26th Marines, which was 1/3 of the division, and we were going somewhere. What we did then, my job, because I was a radio man, when we're loading ships out of Hilo to leave Hawaii, 2 of us go down to be a radio communication between ship and shore as they're loading the ship. And I was down there on New Year's Eve. I spent it sitting in a little pillbox that we had that'd been built a long time ago to help protect the harbor of Hilo, and we were using that. It was a cool night sitting inside there, and we were there for a couple days, loading ships day and night, and then leaving and going on up to the island of Maui to make one last beachhead. In other words, one more practice. I mean, there was always time for one more practice. So we invaded the island of Maui, and we did this with a smoke screen going on. And in my book that I wrote that is here at the museum, we talk about the smoke is being made by small craft with smoke machines on it. So they're circling the ships, and then they're trying to stop the smoke. And so we're over the loudspeaker, we're calling for these men to stop making smoke because it's over with, and what's happening is we're sucking all of the smoke. See, the ship is standing still, and we're sucking all the smoke into our ventilation systems. And we've made our beachhead. We've come back to the ship again now. Now they're making all the smoke. And we're down in the hold of the ship, and they're shouting out for Hawk and Smith to stop making smoke. Hawk and Smith, stop making smoke. Well, we're choking up down in the hold, and finally they turn the fans off because there's no reason to suck in more of that smoke. And if you could imagine the silence, you know, everything, even as I sit here, I can hear the ventilation system working. And in your home, you hear the same. There's always some background noise. And all of a sudden on that ship where you'd been riding on ships before, and now we're riding on this one, and it's silent. You never heard such silence in your life. We sat there at Saipan for a couple of nights, and one night we had an air raid, and because I was a radio man, we were very fortunate on board ship. We would get to go up into the superstructure and help work with the radio people on board ship. Now, we could not listen to the messages coming in because those guys, they are typing messages at 50, 60 words a minute. We were not that caliber. We were lucky if we did 30. But we could run messages around the ship. We could actually, some of the guys could help with bringing in messages that were clear type, you know, just words, not coded. And so it was a good place to be. But when the air raid came around and we heard the sirens and we heard the warnings and everything, we were wondering if above board was going to be a good place or not. But that's just the way it was. And of course, from that point, then we headed for Iwo, and of course we pulled in there. We were going to invade there on the 19th of February. Going back to what today is, today's the 12th. We had 12th of January, 61 years ago. We were leaving, we had just left Pearl Harbor and we were on our way to Eniwetok. Doesn't seem possible, too long ago. But again, when we approached Iwo, they had one last call for anybody to check into sick bay, anything that you need taken care of. Or if you don't, you know, if you are really absolutely sick, why, we'll hold you off and you might go in the next day or two or something like that. But at 4 o'clock in the morning, we all fell out to go down to the mess hall to have a steak dinner. And from that point on, then get all your gear ready. Everybody's hyper because our ship, we were not in the first wave to go ashore. That was somebody else. We were actually not on the first line of fighting. We were in so-called reserve, which meant we were going to go in on about the 6th wave. And so because of that, once again, being on radio man special duty, they said, Dave, why don't you come up on the deck? We've got a radio up here that is in communication with the planes that are flying over the island. We had Navy and Marine pilots that were still strafing the island. This is before 9 a.m. when the invasion was to start. And listening to those radio messages, especially from one airplane. And this particular guy, you could tell by his description of what he was doing, which plane it was. There weren't hundreds of them. There were like one, and then maybe 10, 15, 20 seconds later, and they were following each other, either bombing or strafing or whatever. We got to kidding around about them because we said we could tell the ones that were not married, they dove clear down to the ground and dropped their bombs. The other ones just sort of dipped a little way up here, and they must have been the married ones. But the fellow that I was following listening to did not come up. I mean, he was making a dive down, and the next thing you know, why, the radio communication stopped, and he had been hit and crashed on the island. If you read anything about Iwo Jima was bombed unmercifully for the 3 days before we landed. There were over 22,000 rounds of heavy naval artillery bombardment to that island. But when you're underground and, I don't care how many bombs you drop, you're not going to do what you want to do. But anyway, as the story goes, and the first 3 waves got in with no problem at all. The Japanese were smart enough to say, well, let's just let them come ashore. When they get ashore, there'll be so many of them there that you can't miss any of them. And that's what they did. After they got ashore, they just started machine gun strafing from pillboxes, artillery coming from who knows where. We didn't realize how well planned they had this whole thing set up, but there were artillery pieces clear at the other end of the island that knew every little pattern of that beach. They knew exactly where to drop shells. Mount Suribachi, is on one end of the island. It's 550 some feet tall. We felt that was the eyes of the artillery. Those guys could tell where to put shells and things like that. It's partly true, but not totally, because the people on the other end, they knew where we were doing our landings, and they could plant a shell just within feet of where they wanted it. So by the time that first day was over, we had 845 people killed, with between 9 o'clock in the morning and midnight. That was the thing about Iwo, was that there were no buildings. Where are these people? Well, they were all underground. We were fighting 2 different wars. We were fighting a war above ground, and they were running around through the tunnels underground, coming up behind, all that kind of stuff, When we talk about death and war and things, war is a nasty, nasty business. There's no question about it. When we went in by the time we went in, they were not just shelling people on the beach, they were shooting at the boats coming in. So basically, as reserves, we were going to go in with all of the high mucky mucks in our battalion, Colonel Trotty and Davis and so forth, all of the high-ranking officers. They were all going to ride in on the same boat, and 2 of us radio men go along with them. Well, they got smart and said, hey, we'll put Colonel Trotty in one boat, and Smythe and Greene, which one do you guys want to go where? We flipped a coin. Smythe went with Colonel Trotty, and I went with Major Waters, and I don't know if anyone else was in there of high rank or not. But when we got to the beach, of course, we're in separate boats. We didn't even see each other. I never saw Colonel Trotty again. Major Waters was with me. He was ahead of me, running up to where we were supposed to gather up with the rest of our company. And before I got halfway up the slope, which I probably was less than 300 feet onto the island, here comes Major Waters running back. He's holding his hand. He'd been wounded. And I asked him what to do, and he says, I don't care what you do, I'm going to the beach and get off of this expletive island. And he was a guy that had been trained in Naval Academy, and nobody really liked him. When he'd fall out for parade duty, he would always come out in his whites, and he was half Navy, half Marine Corps. The beach was just the mushiest sand you could imagine. You're told in the first place, do not jump off the front of the landing craft. The landing craft, the front of it drops down and you're going to run out. However, as you land, there are waves hitting the back end of the boat, trying to push you further ashore. And as you leave the boat becomes lighter and it rises up. So there's a very good possibility that it'll rise up. And if you went off the front, that platform would go forward and just slice your legs right off. So you're told to jump off the sides of that platform, that drop deck, and which I did, and I'm immediately up in water and sand up to my knees, and I'm struggling with weight that's probably almost as much weight as I weigh. You're going ashore with 2 canteens full of water, quarter piece. I've got 136 rounds of ammunition. I've got a carbine. I've got a radio on the back that weighs between the radio and the case around it. They put a special waterproof case around it. You're talking about something that weighs at least 40 pounds. My pack is on my front. I look like a paratrooper. I look like I've got a pack on my front. I got a radio on my back. I'm not the handiest, person walking up that. But as you walk up through there were people laying all over, and I thought, well, they must be here for some purpose. And I went up, and then of course, Major Waters left the scene. I continued to go on up further, and I dropped my pack and my radio because I'm not in service, and I found my sergeant. I said, what should I do? And he said, well, those guys, telephone people, need help down there getting all of this telephone wire and stuff up. So I went back to the beach, and I'm starting to help these guys. And as I'm going back to the beach, these people that I saw before are still laying there. Well, on my way back, I'm taking a little better look at them. They're all dead. That evening, without going into great detail, you're going up there and you're trying to make a foxhole. The sand is coming in as fast as you try to scoop it out. Besides that, the Japanese artillery and our artillery that's ashore already are having a duel. And I swear if you stood up, you'd get hit. You had to stay down. You could lay there and look up and see the shells pass. Now you can see a shell. It's not moving as fast as a bullet, but there is a shell and there's sound, of course. You learn to know the sounds of the shells. You can tell whether that shell is going to land near you or going to continue to go on further, stuff like that. That night, my sergeant told me that I was on, again, a special radio duty to go with a machine gun squad down to the far shore of the island, which would be the western shore. We landed on the east shore. I landed on the Red Beach. 28th Marines that were going to take Suribachi landed on Greene Beach, which was right next to Suribachi. We're on the Red Beach. The island is very narrow here, and literally we had cut that island in two almost immediately. We have the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Battalion. We were 3rd Battalion, and either the 1st or 2nd was on the front line at the moment. It was a rainy day. Again, I was in a place not with the other guys. I had been here with a regimental commander. So I'm doing what I was told never to do, but it was the easiest thing to do. Rainy day, who's fighting on a rainy day anyway? So I pick up a telephone line, and as you pick up a telephone line and run with it, there are little tags on it that tell really who that telephone line belongs to, so that I could look at that with a little blue and white gizmo on there, tag, that belonged to the 3rd Battalion, 26th Marines. And if I followed that line, I would get to my command post, which was already up ahead of me. So I'm running the line, which I really shouldn't be doing. And there are very few little trees and stuff left, but they had little pathways. They actually had some things planted on the island. They had little gardens and things like that. There were a few civilians at one time, but there were little rows of trees with pathways in between them. And the trees were pretty well all shot to pieces, but the little stubby things were sticking up. So I'm running up this pathway following this wire, and this pathway rises all of a sudden and then drops down into sort of a slotted arrangement going left and right. And as I get up there, I look ahead, and in this trench in front of me are at least a dozen dead Marines. I finally catch up with our 3rd Battalion headquarters, and it's raining. I find a fellow mate, and we decide to foxhole it together. You always foxhole with somebody so that somebody be on guard while you're trying to sleep. We put a poncho over the top of the foxhole, but before we selected that particular hole, which somebody else had already dug for us beforehand, why, we saw a neat hole, looked like up here with some guys in it already. So we thought we'd go up and join them. We went up there and joined them, only to find out that they were all dead. They had a shell had lit behind them, and their bodies from the waist down were gone, been blown apart. We also, right at that point in time, found out that our command post had been set up, and unfortunately had almost immediately been hit by a round of artillery fire. It hit the command post. So we immediately, here we are, we're replacing other people on the front line. Our commander, Colonel Trotty, is killed. Major Davis is killed. Major Waters was already off the island. So the top 3 people that would have ordinarily run this thing are gone. Our lieutenant that was in charge of our platoon of communicators is wounded. We never see him again. The sergeant major is killed, and a couple other guys are either wounded or killed. So the whole nucleus, the head of this particular battalion of men, 1,000 men, is wiped out in one fell swoop.